Hey everyone, today we'll be looking at a 2019 horror thriller movie called The Other Lamb. Let's get into it. The movie starts with two young ladies, Selah and Tamar, sitting close to a waterfall. They seem to be having a cordial time as they fix their gaze on the waterfall. The movie portrays an isolated community, inhabited almost entirely by women and girls. The community of women is headed by only one single male that resides among them, and they seem to worship him. They refer to him as the shepherd. The shepherd, in turn, calls the women his wives and the children his daughters. In the next scene, we see the shepherd and his wives having dinner. When he's done eating, he thanks his wives and his daughters. As the shepherd makes his way to his bedroom, he selects one of his wives that would go with him for the night. The next morning, the shepherd, his wives and daughters gather in the courtyard. As the shepherd addresses them, Selah fixes her gaze on him. She seems to like him a lot. The shepherd ends his sermon and tells them to pray. As they pray to him, he dips his hands into the blood of a sacrificed lamb and rubs it on the faces of his wives and his daughters. Moments later, Selah and Tamar are standing together as they sight the shepherd from afar. Selah wants to be alone with the shepherd, so she sends Tamar on an errand. As Selah and the shepherd take a walk, he teases her and tells her that she's just as beautiful as her mother. Selah softly tells the shepherd to tell her the story of the first time he saw her mother, and this creates a romantic moment between them for a while. The shepherd breaks the silence and tells her to get her hair braided as he leaves the scene. In the following scene, we see one of the wives, named Eloise, narrating her experience with the shepherd. She tells Selah and another sister about the blissful and perfect experience she had with the shepherd. Selah doesn't seem to be happy with this. She responds to Eloise harshly because Eloise is the same age as them. The other sisters scold Selah for talking to a wife in that manner, as the shepherd has made it clear that daughters are meant to respect their wives. Selah is reported to another wife, and this earns her an errand. Shortly after that, we see Selah on her way to a hut. On the road, the body of a dead bird with maggots feeding on it draws her attention. In the wooden hut, we see two unkempt and unhealthy women. These were the cursed wives. Selah refers to them as impure as she engages in a mean chat with one of them. Then she gives them food and leaves. That night, Selah watches over her younger sisters while they sleep. She looks through the window and sees one of the wives entering the shepherd's room. Due to the illumination in the shepherd's room, Selah sees them as they start to engage in an adult act. In the next scene, wives are rubbing the shepherd's body in a way that depicts their carrying out a form of cleansing. One of the wives tells them that the lamb would soon arrive. In another room, two wives are also cleaning Selah's body as she prepares to meet with the shepherd. The wives tell her words to prepare her. We then see Selah lying alone in the fields. She falls asleep for a while before being woken up by the sound of a lamb. She stands up and sees a bleeding lamb on the verge of death. Instantly, she checks herself and discovers that she's bleeding from her private parts. Later that night, Selah sees that she's still bleeding, which makes her unable to sleep. Tamar asked her what happened to the lambs. Selah explains to her that she slept while she was in the field, and a wild dog killed one of the lambs. She further adds that the wives took her to the church to report to the shepherd. However, he forgave her. In another scene, we see Selah wide awake in bed while her sisters sleep. She hears the siren of a police car, so she peeps through the window and sees the shepherd talking to a policeman. The policeman tells the shepherd that the community has to vacate the premises they reside in, and they had just a few days to do that. The next morning, the shepherd gathers his wives and his daughters and informs them of the grievous news. He tells them that they must leave and assure them they'll find a new home. The scene that follows shows Selah sitting alone in the courtyard. She's worried that they have to leave. The shepherd sees her, and he encourages her to be strong as he's relying on her. The community gathers with their belongings and flock, and they set out on a journey to find a new place to live. They walk through the forests and mountains, pitching their tents to rest at night and setting out in the morning to continue their journey. That night, Selah has a nightmare. She sees herself in a body of water with two other sisters, then the shepherd killing a lamb, after which she sees a decaying lamb and her garment stained. The next day, during their journey, they come across an abandoned house in the forest. The women go in and check the house. However, the shepherd tells them they cannot stay there, as it's a broken place made by broken people, so they pitch their tent outside the house. At night, Selah is sitting alone beside the fire. She fixes her gaze on the shepherd's tent. Later, she enters the house and stares at a picture on the wall that seems to have caught her attention earlier that day. In the next scene, Selah is throwing up and coughing. She seems to be unwell. She checks the blood on her thigh in the tent. and instantly one of the sisters screams that Sela is impure. The evening appears to be windy, so they pitch their tent. This time, Sela is with one of the cursed wives. They're isolated from the others. Sela asks the cursed wife about her story. The woman narrates to Sela that the shepherd gave her his grace initially, but now he claims he's punishing her for her vanity. Sela doesn't seem to believe the woman. Hence, the woman tells her that the shepherd's grace is like the sun. It's glorious and beautiful at first, and then it burns. She then tells Sela that she wouldn't understand yet. The woman goes on to tell Sela how her mother had an infection after she gave birth to her, but the shepherd refused to take her to the hospital, claiming it was a test of her faith. They then continue their journey. This time, they walk close to the road. 3 ladies driving a car see the community members as they walk in the rain. One of the ladies is Sela's doppelganger. On the other end, Sela stares at the moving vehicle as tears drop from her eyes. Now it's night and they're having dinner. Sela stares meanly at Eloise's pregnant tummy. Eloise also stares back at Sela as she rubs her tummy. Soon after, Sela sits with the cursed wife. Sela asks her why she's still sticking around. The cursed wife replies to Sela that she's afraid of leaving, as she's been there for a long time and she doesn't even know who she is anymore. In a new scene, we get to see Eloise in distress. She's in labor. The other wives tell her to birth the baby, but Eloise is reluctant to have a baby at that spot. Eventually, Eloise births the baby. However, she dies. During her cremation, the cursed wife blames the shepherd for Eloise's death and calls him by his real name, Michael. Moments later, Sela noticed the cursed wife had stopped journeying with them, so she goes back and asks her why she stopped. The cursed wife informs her that the shepherd intends to abandon Eloise's baby in the forest because it's a boy, and there can only be one male in the community, which is himself. With this, the cursed wife decides to take care of the baby. She bids Sela farewell and goes her separate way. In the subsequent scene, we see that all the women are tired of walking. They are exhausted. They sit on the floor like they've lost hope. Tamar then tells them she sees something on the other side. Tamar's statement seems to annoy the shepherd. He yells at her to lead them while continuously hitting her. Sela is not happy with the shepherd for this brutal act. Moments later, they finally arrive at a valley with a body of moving water. Their hopeless faces brighten. The shepherd calls the place Eden, and they settle there. Not long after, the shepherd baptizes each one of them. When it was Sela's turn, he decides to keep her head underwater for an extended period. This causes her to almost drown. The scene that follows shows the sisters sleeping in their tent. Sela and Tamar are still awake. The shepherd comes to their tent and calls Sela to come to his tent. Tamar advises her not to go, but Sela turns deaf ears to Tamar's advice and she goes to the shepherd's tent. In the shepherd's tent, Sela lays on his bed. The shepherd caresses Sela's body, telling her she's beautiful. He goes ahead to force his fingers into Sela's mouth and forces himself on her. This annoys Sela. She sees a vision of her sisters killing the shepherd. The following morning, the sisters discover that the wives are all gone. They search the woods and then go to the shore, where they see the shepherd kneeling with the garments of the wives, but the wives are nowhere to be found. The shepherd tells them he had to take that path for the daughters to become wives. He beckons on Sela, calling her his wife. Sela responds by telling him he's not their shepherd and she doesn't want his grace. Sela's statement annoys the shepherd and he slaps her. This makes Sela furious and she retaliates by slapping him. In the final scene, 2 patrol officers found the lifeless bodies of the wives in the marsh. The 2 officers go into the forest and they find the shepherd's body tied in between 2 trees with a ram's horn on his head. The movie ends with the sisters gathering together with Sela holding a kid.